Great, so good evening. My name is David Montes de Oca with Oakland Unified and Quality Community School Development. I just want to make sure that as part of the purpose of this evening is to help provide some increased clarity around this process that's being implemented and this criteria. There are two packets that are right outside the door of this boardroom, and if anyone didn't have an opportunity to pick up these two packets, I just want to encourage that for the next section that we'll be discussing, it may be particularly helpful to have these packets in addition to what will be projected here on the screen. So I just would encourage anyone who doesn't have these to go ahead and pick one up just outside the door. So what I'm going to do at this moment is just provide an overview of the criteria that the board approved and then talk specifically about the results of applying that criteria to all of the schools here in Oakland. So this slide, I want to first name that this is a multi-step process, and it starts with an essential question. This guiding question is what drives the majority of the application of this criteria. The question is essentially, where do we need to operate schools? The district currently has 101 schools serving 38,000 students, and pursuant to what the superintendent has shared, it's clear to us that we are operating too many schools for too few students. So because we've been asked this question of how to reduce schools, we begin by asking the question of where do we need to operate schools? Where schools are located in Oakland did not happen necessarily in a systematic manner over the last 100 years of their development. And so at this moment, we ask this question to help establish our schools in places where they're needed most, particularly where our families live and where they're enrolling in school and where we have facility capacity. So this first question, we begin to apply step number one, which is to look at data for population density, enrollment, and facility capacity. And on page 21, of this packet, which is a few slides in, I won't jump into now, but just to note, each of the 12 points of information for each school is what comprises the data that allows us to ask this first question about where do we need to operate schools. I'm going to use two terms to refer to our schools, and I just want to be very explicit about those two terms. I'm going to use the term that references schools located where we need them most and schools located where we need them least. What that is not intended to suggest by any measure is that the school programs, the staff, the families, the students involved in those schools are more or less needed. This is specifically to address the question of where do we need to operate schools. So as I walk through these steps, I will reference schools as being located where we most need or least need to operate schools because we've been asked the question of considering where we would reduce schools. So the first step in the criteria asks us to rank order all schools from where least needed to where most needed based on population density, enrollment, and facilities. And again, that's based on the 12 points of data that are represented here in the packet. Things like how many students live within a certain proximity of the school, how many students live within the attendance area of the school, the percent of students that live inside or outside the attendance area that are attending the school, the enrollment over the last few years, the change in enrollment over the last few years, the number of classrooms that are in the facility, and the number of classrooms being utilized currently in those facilities. So these are the factors that allow us to rank order the schools in this way, and so we essentially generate a list of schools most needed, located where schools are most needed, and schools located where they are least needed. And for the alternative education school programs, we have 13 alternative education schools. And in this evaluation, those schools do not have the same applicable rationale as other schools. So, for example, in one of our continuation schools, how many students live within a mile of that school is not necessarily relevant to why students might enroll in that continuation school. We have a community day school for students that are expelled. The enrollment fluctuation in a school that serves students that may be expelled is not as relevant as it would be for traditional schools. So we will be recommending to the board and as staff that we would apply an alternative evaluation to define the appropriate set of schools for our alternative education program. So in step two, for our schools that are ranked from where we need them most to where we need them least, we have identified a set of schools that would be undergoing other restructuring. These are schools that are currently engaged in or are initiating planning around a number of other strategies that include possible grade configuration changes to become, for example, a K-8 or a 6-12 school. Schools that have been identified to undergo transformation and are already in a planning process to redesign those school programs in order to provide a high-quality school option. Or schools that have been identified to implement a STEM or science, technology, engineering, and math program in a systematic way through a feeder pattern of schools from elementary, middle to high school. So these schools that we've identified for other restructuring, this criteria at this step would say to exclude these schools from continued consideration for closure because of the other restructuring that is taking place. So in step 3, we now focus on the half of the schools that would be located in the ranking of where we least need school programs. We start first by identifying among those schools which of those schools do not share an attendance boundary with any other schools that are within the half of those ranked where they are least needed. The rationale for identifying schools that do not share an attendance boundary is that we want to mitigate the threat that we would potentially close 2 schools that share an attendance boundary and leave a large void of school programming. So we first identify schools among those ranked where we least need to operate a program and identify those schools that do not share an attendance boundary as schools that would remain on the list for possible closure. Step 4 then asks us to, for the remaining schools in the half that would be identified as schools located where we least need to operate a program, among the schools that share an attendance boundary, we compare those schools using additional factors that we'll discuss briefly to nonetheless identify among those schools sharing an attendance boundary which schools would remain on the list for closure consideration. So then in step 3 and step 4, we have identified schools that would remain for consideration among the schools that are ranked as those located where we least need to operate a school program that we would consider for recommendation for school closure. The analysis that we've done to date that's presented here this evening that we'll speak to has only gone to step 4. But you'll note from our packet that you have on page 7 that the criteria has 6 steps. Step 5, which has not been implemented yet, is a step where we would evaluate 2 things. 1, our special education programming to make sure that we don't inadvertently have a detrimental impact on our special education programming by virtue of the schools that would be identified for closure. And the second is to consider receiving school options so that we're certain that any school closures would nonetheless result in the opportunity to provide every child and family displaced by a school closure the opportunity to have access to a high-quality program. So the next step in the process would be that kind of detailed consideration before the final step, which is the recommendations that the superintendent would make to the Board of Education regarding specific schools to recommend for closure. So on the next slide, you see and again, my recommendation for our public audience to have the packet is to acknowledge that the information here is difficult to read from the screen. But what you see is 3 lists of schools. One is our elementary schools on the far left, and just to note, they go on to the next page, so they spill over to the next page. You see our middle schools in the middle, and you see our high schools to the right. Our alternative education schools are set off in a box to the right. And what you see here is you see them located in a ranking from schools identified where they are located, where we least need to operate a program, going down to schools located where we most need to operate a program. You will see schools that are highlighted in gray. They are at the bottom of each of the grade level lists. And again, on the second page, you will see the gray elementary schools. Those are the schools in step 2 that were identified for other restructuring and were excluded from the process for the remainder of the steps. Those are the schools that are highlighted in gray. The schools then at the top in both the elementary and the middle schools that are highlighted in yellow as a result of steps 3 and 4 are schools identified in the criteria that would be considered for school closure recommendations. Now, just to note, this is not a set of recommendations. The steps around step 5, needing to analyze the special education program impact, and additionally to analyze the receiving school options for children and families, as well as to ultimately ensure that we're meeting a goal of 1, ensuring that we can expand quality in all of our school programs, and 2, release enough revenue that can support the sustainability of the district. A final recommendation would include some set of schools identified here through this closure, through this criteria. In the high schools, I want to note that there are no yellow schools highlighted. That is because in step 2, all of the schools that would have been located in the section of schools identified where we least need to operate program were already identified for other restructuring. The only remaining schools that were not identified for other restructuring are in fact those schools, high schools, located where we most need to operate programs. So there's not a recommendation that would come forward that would recommend a specific high school for closure. That being said, it's noted here at the bottom of this slide, the restructuring work that's happening in our high schools. For 7 of those high schools, there is a redesign process that would result in 7 high schools becoming 2 high-quality school programs, and therefore reducing the actual number of schools by 5. We could talk through that work, which is happening specifically at the Castlemont and the Fremont high school campuses.
Repeat that again.
Sure. So the work that is happening at the Fremont and Castlemont high schools, which is a redesign process, will impact currently 7 high schools, 4 among the Castlemont high schools, which is the Youth Empowerment School Program, the East Oakland School for the Arts Program, the Business Information Technology Program, and the Leadership Prep. That work will result in a single high school on that campus. And at the Fremont campus, the work that is happening there will result in a single school as well. So ultimately, that work will result in those 7 schools becoming 2 single school options. Within the packet, there are a sequence of steps that show each of the schools as they go through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is a summary of the results, so this is essentially the end of step 4. So we'll allow questions from the board and others to help drive what additional information we can provide about the process that would lead to these particular schools in this particular order.